recording here, and there we go. Okay. Oh, yes. Here, I'll tell you what, just scoot next to me for today since it's just the two of us here. Okay, so we are going to do today for Israel what we did for the United States and Jewish immigration to this hemisphere. So we are finally at the point in the story of us where it makes sense to work backwards from where we are today. Then it makes sense to move forward from the history that we have been doing after thousands of years of this. So today, about 40% of all the Jews in the world live in Israel, and about 40% of all the Jews in the world live in North America, primarily the United States and Canada. It's probably like 42% in Israel these days and 38% in the Western Hemisphere, but it's still pretty close, which is to say that for today's Jewish world, sure, there is world Jewry. Certainly, there are Jewish populations that are significant outside of these two poles, but unquestionably, just like when it was the north of Israel and Babylon, or just like when it was Babylon and Spain, or just like when it was Poland and the north of Israel, we are once again at a moment in time where there are two great poles of Jewish civilization with random outposts of Jewish community elsewhere. So I don't say this to denigrate or to diminish European Jewry or Asian Jewry outside of Israel or all of these other Jewish communities, but the reality is South American Jewry. But the reality is we really have two major Jewish civilizations today, that in North America and that in the land of Israel and in the state of Israel more clearly. That makes sense, yeah? So when we go backwards from there, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the ways that immigration happened to these places. We are going to look at the way that the politics of the world at those moments impacted that immigration. And one of the themes that I'm hoping is going to emerge is just how different the ethnicity is a made up word with made up boundaries, but the ethnic makeups of the Jews of Israel, ethnic, cultural, sociological, whatever words you want to put there, makeup of Jews who ended up in Israel are radically different from those who ended up in the United States, to the point where the two communities are very, very different from each other, much more different than often we understand them to be today. Does that make sense as a setup? Any questions or thoughts before we jump in? Okay. So here's the quick and dirty review of Jewish immigration to the United States, which we did in some depth in our last session. And actually, there's been new news about this. Did everyone follow the story about Columbus's Jewish genetics? There's always been, or a long time, been rumblings about this, and it just makes sense when you look at the timeline of it all. I saw an interesting post on Facebook. Someone said, "What kind of Jewish family names their kid Christopher?" And the answer, actually, I think from a Story of Us perspective, is a Converso family who is trying desperately to fit in. In some ways, it's not so different from, think about the highly American names that Jewish immigrants to the United States named their kids in the 1950s. In fact, sometimes Jews focus so much on highly American feeling names that they became Jewish names, to the point where you don't find non-Jews who have many of those names. Max is one of those names, right, for a generation of people. Not always, but often. Sheldon, things like this. Anyhow, so about 5,000 Jews make their way over to the Western Hemisphere, primarily first the Caribbean, eventually to what would become the United States in the years following the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. These 5,000 end up so that by the time the United States is founded, we believe that's about the number of Jews in the early American colonies. From 1800 to 1850 or so, about 50,000 Jews from the Rhineland, from what would become Germany, uh, become involved overwhelmingly in the attempts at revolutions, liberalizing revolutions in Germany. These revolutions fail, and they get on boats and they head to the United States. So by the time you get to 1850, there is really one Jewish community in the United States. There are some outposts of the old Portuguese Spanish Jewish communities, right? There are still some historic Spanish Portuguese communities in New York and Boston and places like this. Uh, but these 50,000 German immigrants end up in the German cities: St. Louis, Cincinnati, Peoria, Milwaukee, uh, Cleveland, on and on. Pittsburgh, uh, and these are the cities that eventually become the founders of the Reform movement. And it's in those cities that you find congregations that were part of the original creation of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Uh, this is where you get, United Hebrew is a part of that. But so is Anshe Emeth, the community Karen and I were rabbis of in Peoria. They were one of the founders of the union as well, because that's where Jews were. Then from about 1880, and here's where it'll transition over to our immigration towards Israel in a moment. From 1880 to World War One, basically, you get 2 to 2.5 million Jews from Greater Poland, from Eastern Europe, who are ethnically cleansed and make their way to the United States en masse. So here is where we will split into Israel and the United States for a moment. This is also the time period, starting in the late 1800s, when Zionism as a political movement is born. And this is a word that is incredibly slippery and incredibly, I think, problematic to conversations these days, often. Uh, I think it's actually that lots of people have a strong definition of Zionism that they believe to be correct, that everyone else needs to change their definition around. But it turns out that these definitions are often not mutually compatible with each other. So there's lots of talking past each other that happens when we talk about Zionism. But when we talk about the original Zionist movement, the real way to understand this is as a European style nationalism. Right? This is the time period when nationalism is the most in vogue, when nation states, democratic liberal nation states, are the new up and coming idea of Europe. And so the question of what to do with this long-standing minority population of Jews in Europe, the obvious answer to many European thinkers is a nation state for the Jews. Just as they were developing nation states for the Germans and for the Italians, and we know how well those worked out, and for the Spaniards and for the Brits, and so on and so forth, nation state was also the model for Jews. Internally, we refer to this as Zionism. Externally, you'll remember that once we got into the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, we started talking about the rise of European Christian messianic views that focused on Jews returning to our homeland as a way to bring about the Messianic age. So we see external to the Jewish community this focus on it, whereas internal to the Jewish community, we also have all of these models of nation states developing, and things are getting worse and worse by the moment for the Jewish community. Right, 1880 to 1917 or so, we have 2.5 million Jews flee. So Zionism is one of the political ideas that begins to emerge during this time period. So we have to go back to today for a moment in order to keep telling this story. It is in Israel's self-interest and American Jewish self interest, and in some ways American self interest, to understand the creation of the state of Israel as being the project of the Jewish people. We want to take pride in it. We want to have a sense of our own agency. I'm putting aside sort of the more problematic relationships to Israel in Israeli politics and so on today. Um, but there are reasons why we want to take pride in it, and we want to see Israel as having agency and Jews as powerful, particularly in a post-Holocaust world. And does this all make sense? What I'm saying? But here's what you have to realize: we weren't powerful enough to convince Roosevelt to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz. We also weren't powerful enough to convince the Brits to do anything about the Holocaust, which means we weren't powerful enough to create our own nation state. And it means we weren't powerful enough to convince the Brits to issue the Balfour Declaration, which said that eventually Israel, or the land of British Mandate Palestine, would be divided into a Jewish land and a land for the Arab community there, eventually named the Palestinian community. Uh, None of those were places we had power. And a part of that is the reality that the Zionist movement during this time period, this whole time period we were talking about, 1880 to 1914, 17, 24, whatever date you want to put on it, isn't powerful. They are fringy. They are fringy within the Jewish community. And the Jews who are a part of the Zionist movement aren't powerful, in whatever power they have doesn't come from their connections and support in the Jewish community. It comes from the support of those in the European Christian political leadership community, who often see this as either a theological or a political solution to the Jewish problem. If you had put the vote on the Balfour Declaration to the Jewish community of Europe, it may not have passed. But it wasn't about the Jews, it was about the British. Does that make sense, what I just said? Any thoughts or questions on that before we keep going? I know this is just a really different way of presenting Jewish and Zionist history than many of us are familiar with. Really taking out a lot of the agency, the Jewish agency here. Different than, of course, the group called the Jewish Agency, which is a group involved in Israel also, but that's not what we're talking about. Okay. So there are a few small waves, what are known as the early waves of Aliyah, that happened during this time period. Often the dynamic is that wealthier Western European Jews are paying to have early settlements as a solution for Eastern European Jews who are fleeing pogroms, and the Western European Jews don't want them in Western Europe because they're embarrassing. So instead, you have groups like the Rothschilds who buy land for wineries and then set it up for Eastern European Jews to go start wineries. By the way, what happens is often a total disaster, because most of these Eastern European Jews are kids who are going there who know nothing about farming. They haven't come from farming communities. They don't know agriculture. They don't know wine. They don't know wine making. They don't know anything. And so they become entirely dependent on the Rothschilds, and it's a boondoggle, and there's all sorts of corruption happening, and it's a wild set of stories.
Does Baron de Hirsch also fit into this?
Baron de Hirsch Rothschild. Yep, exactly.
Yeah,
Ex-
and who also paid for people to come to New Jersey.
oh, there you go. There you go. So we see these earliest settlements like that, many of which fail. Uh, and then we see a second generation of them. The second generation is distinctive. Now, actually, let's pause for a moment. Now we're getting into the 20th century, early 20th century, early 1900s. So imagine for a moment that you are an Eastern European Jew. The easy answer is to go to America. I mean, none of this is easy. But America is straightforward. You're allowed to go. You have opportunity there. The land is, the streets are paved with cheese, the whole shtick, right? The Golden Medina. The America's the easy place to go. So why is it that someone instead goes to try to tough it out in the middle of the desert in British Mandate Palestine? The answer is intense ideological commitment. So you either get intensely Zionistic people, people who believe that there is no possible safe place for Jews outside of a place that we control, and you get intensely socialist Jews. So this is where you get the kibbutz movement. These intentional communes of often very young people, 16 to 25-year-olds, who are fleeing their traditionalist community, throwing off their tefillin, becoming radically secular, progressive. They didn't know the word feminist, but feminist for their moment, certainly, egalitarian in remarkable ways. This is a group that believed the Israeli flag should have uh, seven stars on it for the most distinctive part of this new country, which was going to be the 7-hour workday. This was going to be a socialist utopian light onto the nations. The whole world would have a socialist revolution led by the Jews returning to their homeland in a socialist utopia. These are the people, these dreamers, who end up in Israel in the early 1900s, who end up in British Mandate Palestine in the early 1900s. So again, you're only talking about the fringy 5% or whatever it is. Uh, by the time the state of Israel is declared in 1948, you've had about a 500,000 of these people make their way there. Most of them didn't come until after 1924. So, what happens in 1924 that causes immigration to massively spike in Jewish immigration to Israel, massively spike? Anyone know? Anyone have a thought? Yeah, Marion.
Isn't that when the U.S. stopped, passed all our anti-immigration?
Exactly, exactly. When is it that Jews move to Israel? When is it that the Zionist movement gets large numbers of human beings to be a part of it? It's only after Jews can no longer come to America. It's just such a different telling of the story than many of us grew up with, right? The Zionist movement and Israel today doesn't like this telling because it should be focused on our agency. We went, people were committed, Zionists, they chose to go here, they created the country, new Jews with our labor, our power, we're not dependent on the world anymore. But the reality is, Jews only began to move to Israel in numbers not because of ideological reasons, Zionism or socialism, but only once there was nowhere else to go. Only once we were being kicked out of Eastern Europe, it was deeply unsafe, was there any uh, real interest of people going to Israel in large numbers. Again, just such a different telling of this narrative than we are used to, I believe. Marilyn, I saw you were unmuted for a second. Did you have a question?
No, I was saying the same thing as Mary, that the exclusion that's the beginning of closing the border.
Yep. Yep. Uh, so again, we can see the ways that, and this has been a story of us theme, the ways that it is the currents of the world that Jews are sort of shifted around on, even as we pretend like we're, paddling the boat in whatever direction we want. Uh, so it's only at that point that you end up getting most of that 500,000 Jews who are there by the time Israel is declared in 1948. Okay, that was the very quick and dirty version of early Zionist history. So I just want to pause again for any thoughts or questions before we keep moving forward with some maps. Nothing?
No, I just think it's really curious and interesting to reflect more about this agency thing. I think your analysis is obviously it's what it is. Uh, but how that trickles down and around in so many different ways from where things are today. I
Um,
don't know if anybody feels like talking about it, but it just seems like it's really an interesting topic.
yeah, and the ways that this intersects with modern notions of settler colonialism and is Israel a settler colonial state and right and what's interesting is I think you can look at this and say something like the early Zionist movement was a settler colonial project where almost none of the participants were settler colonial. They were all refugees, even as it was European, non-Jewish, modeled after. There's all these intersecting layers that don't fit with each other and don't fit comfortably, and um, yeah, it's kind of wild. Sarah.
Can you say what you said about the Balfour Act in England again? I kind of missed that.
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration, I think 1917, is that right, Larry? Larry's nodding.
Yeah.
Balfour Declaration is uh, Great Britain issues a policy paper stating that their intention with British Mandate Palestine. So let's go backwards a little bit here. Um, Prior to World War One, what we would now call Israel and Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire, in part of the Syrian province of the Ottoman Empire. It was all sort of divided there, and then there was a southern area that included some of what we would now call southern Israel. Uh, but it was all part of the Syrian uh, uh, area of the Ottoman Empire. Post Ottoman Empire, meaning after World War One, uh, this ends up being controlled by Britain, and it's known as the British Mandate of Palestine, given to it by the League of Nations. So, British Mandate Palestine, Britain declares that their ultimate intention with this is to create two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs in the region. Uh, and that declaration is known as the Balfour Declaration. Marion.
So for, I want to know about Zionism and or immigration from uh, from the countries around the Mediterranean. You know, from
Extremely
non-Ashkenaz.
limited at this point. You basically are not seeing Zionism in the Mediterranean in Arab Jewish communities at this point.
Is there any instinct at all among non-Ashkenazi Jews to go back to the motherland kind of thing? I've never read anything on that.
So the answer is that there is it's culturally and in some ways theologically a part of everything. Right? You turn towards Jerusalem when you say Amidah, the Michamocha, if you understand it in its real original context, is really all about a return to Israel within our prayers and keeping that focus there. The whole notion of redemption in Judaism and Jewish theology is collective and political, and the notion that we will once again be a free people in our own land. But as an actual political and practical movement, it's extremely absent during this time period from Jews outside of the Ashkenazi world, um, which I think is the same thing as saying things have gotten intolerable in the Ashkenazi world. That's where I get to with the 2 to 2.5 million Jews who flee from Eastern Europe to America. It's in the interest of our own American romanticism to tell a story of coming to this country for opportunity. 2.5 million people don't leave their homes and everything that they've known for distant shores for opportunity. They leave because it's not safe. Um, right? They have the opportunity to not die. They have the opportunity to not uh, be significantly impoverished and forced conscription. They were, and sometimes they were literally told they had to leave, as Sarah Kaplan is saying. Uh, so that's what we're dealing with in the Ashkenazi world, and it is just not the same in the Arab world at this time. We're going to see this uh, as the Jews of the Arab world are liquidated, but that will come a little later. There was another hand, I think. Okay, let's keep going. So we have this immigration towards Israel once Jews can no longer come to America. But what happens is that there are forces all of a sudden that start to create radically different Jewish identities for those Jews who end up in American shores and those Jews who end up in British Mandate Palestine. In British Mandate Palestine, Jewish identity shifts more and more into European style nationality. That becomes the model. Jews are a nation, a people who are recreating a state. They are creating settlements, though that word means something a little different then than it does today. They are creating a Jewish identity that is fundamentally non religious. Some of them are the norm, in fact, I would say is uh, anti religious. And so Jewish identity more and more in that setup where it is not the question of are you a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim? It's are you a Jew or an Arab or a Brit? That's what it looks like in British Mandate Palestine during these years. Jew, Brit, Arab. So you can see the ways that that sort of setup would create a Jewish identity and incentivize more and more Jewish identity around nationality. That makes sense, right? The exact same time in America, you have 2 to 2.5 million of these Ashkenazi Eastern European immigrants who show up. And the real question now remember, for the Jews of the Ashkenaz, we were the minority of Christian Europe. As far as I can tell, everywhere in the world has a majority population and a group that is deemed as the minority population that is exploited and demonized and victimized and made to be vulnerable and taken advantage of. And right, just unfortunately, it seems that that is the case everywhere. And in Europe, for most of the last 1500 years, the significant other of Europe is to be a Jew. Are you a European or are you a Jew? Are you a Brit or are you a Jew? Are you a French person or are you a Jew? So in the United States, of course, it's a white supremacist dynamic. Are you white or are you a person of color? Are you white or are you black? And that's the setup in America where 2.5 million people show up who understand their self identity as being the minority, and they show up on these shores, and it's not so clear how Jews are going to be racialized, how Ashkenazi Jews are going to be racialized. Uh, Today, I just want to say the majority of black Jews in the United States are also Ashkenazi. So Ashkenazi is not a synonym for white in the United States, and it's a mistake when we do that. Uh, However, when we're talking about this time period, what we are talking about are Ashkenazi Jews who show up in the US and are trying to figure out, America's trying to figure out whether they will be racialized as white or as people of color. And we see a big difference in the North and the South, and we see a difference in places where Jews congregate in large numbers versus where we don't. And we'll go into some more depth in that in the future. But what happens in the broadest of senses is that Ashkenazi Jews are able to acculturate into America, meaning we're able to become white in the United States, by turning Jewish identity into a faith. So, in the same way that not Israeli, but British Mandate Palestine, the sociology and the politics of that place in that moment incentivized Jewish identity to become national, the politics of the United States during this time period incentivizes Jewish identity to become a faith, a Protestant based faith. This is the time period when the synagogue becomes the center of Jewish life. It was brand new. That had never been the case before. Never, anywhere. But in the United States, the synagogue is the center of Jewish life. Why? Because we were recreating Jewish identity around a church model. You go once a week on the Sabbath to the synagogue to do Jewish, just like our neighbors would go once a week on their Sabbath to do Christian. And so, in that way, Jews in the United States, Ashkenazi immigrants, are able to, over a couple generations, become white by turning their Jewishness into Judaism and a faith. This is where you get the sorts of phenomenons of people who say, well, I'm not really Jewish, I don't believe in God. You hear that a lot less today. Or the example that I gave, if anyone came to the breakout session that we did, there's a question. This was the example given by the Tzitz Eliezer, an ultra-Orthodox thinker. If there is a woman who has married a non-Jew, an Anglican, and converts to Anglicanism, no longer married, and wants to come back to the Jewish community, does she have to convert? Can she convert? Traditional Judaism says no. She can come back. She never left. She was always a Jew. She became an apostate Jew. She became a heretical Jew. She became someone outside the community. She became all of these things, but she never stopped being a Jew in a traditional context because belief and practice have no bearing on whether you were a Jew. But for classical Reform Judaism, absolutely. She stopped being a Jew. She converted. She became something else. She became another faith. To be a Jew is to be a part of a faith. And if you stopped being a Jew, then you are no longer a Jew. You are a Christian. And if you'd like to become a Jew again, you'll need to convert to come back. Did that make sense right there? The Tzitz Eliezer is ultra-Orthodox and so not living in a Israeli context, but in some ways you can use this notion of Jewish identity as being almost racialized, national, as the Israeli approach, and the American approach being the faith-based one. Okay, thoughts, questions on any of this?
Does the same thing apply to a man?
Yeah, same thing applies to a man. I only said woman because the specific text that we looked at from the Tzitz Eliezer during the breakout session was the question of a woman who converted to Anglicanism for exactly that setup. Yep, exactly. Thanks, Ray. Paul.
Danny, got a quick question, because you said, how Jewish folks would go to temple or pray weekly, once a week, but your Orthodox and I don't know how big conservative was, but they're praying every day. So how do you differentiate that?
So there certainly are daily minions, but there have always been people who go to daily minions and participate in the daily minion and the daily prayer services. But the move towards the focus on Sabbath being the big public prayer day is a Christian modeled idea. There's all sorts of other examples. If you grew up standing for the Shema, it's because we modeled it on the Protestants when they stood up for their declaration of faith. The way that the CRC's liturgy is in some ways an odd duck because we took 1970s Judaism, which was still in some ways modeled on this, and have evolved our own version of that since. Now I'm talking the liturgy here exclusively, the prayer book. Uh, uh, and so you still have some of this in the CRC Siddur as well, whereas the contemporary Reform Siddur includes much more peoplehood kind of stuff in it and has moved away significantly from some of these pieces. In fact, I would say that the whole notion of having prayers that exist independent of a Jewish liturgical framework, and that's how I would describe CRC Siddur and the Gates series of Siddurs in the Reform movement, is itself modeled on that Christian version as opposed to sort of a classically Orthodox version. And all of this speaks to the ways in which becoming a faith community, Protestant style faith community, was a way of becoming white in the United States. Annette.
Yeah. What about the Jews that went to Israel? Was it a race rather than a
So
faith?
yeah, right. So as all of these incentives, and again, what I hope you're taking away from this is that things like standing up for the Shema are downstream of these incentives. Right? The incentives are all about being able to exist in America with the most ease as possible. All the little changes are a result of that. In the same way that that happens in the United States to turn Jewish community into or Jewish identity into religious identity, the incentive structures in Israel or British Mandate Palestine, where Jews are a minority that is racialized, that is living in small closed communities, that is in a relationship of somewhere between adversarial or neighborly, depending on the moment, but still very different from each other, with local populations, whether they be Arab or Brit. All of that turns Jewish identity over in Israel into a national or even close to racial version of this. Let me give you a contemporary example from Israel that helps. Uh, I've been listening to the Ezra Klein podcast interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates about Israel. Has anyone else listened to that? If you haven't, I so recommend that. Actually, it was powerful. Um, but Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about a recent trip, and he was in the West Bank in Hebron, which is the worst of the occupation, um, and was in Hebron and talking about uh, the clear Jim Crow, worst of Jim Crow era feelings and sense of the difference between the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinian populations in these areas. And he talked all about how one of the Israeli soldiers was questioning him about what religion his grandparents were, because he realized that religion and religious identity was almost racialized over there. The side note that he talks about and goes into some depth in the Ezra Klein podcast in a really interesting way is that the soldier who was enforcing what Ta-Nehisi Coates referred to as apartheid, and frankly, if you go to Hebron, the word seems to fit closer than it doesn't, at least in places like that. Um, uh, he talks about how the soldier enforcing this and asking him what religion his grandparents were and treating him differently based on whether they were Christian or Muslim is an Ethiopian Jew. And the ways that race is entirely socially constructed and constructed differently in Israel. That the religious racial dynamic was much more significant than the whatever skin-based racial, even as that exists clearly in Israeli society as well. Uh, but the point being that I think you can see in that example the ways that Israeli society and just the surrounding populations incentivize Jewish identity into that racialized view, even as the American sociological influences are incentivizing it into religious categories. Did that make sense? I know these are big ideas. Okay, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I was just curious. I'd always been under the impression that Orthodox Judaism had a very strong influence in Israel. But it sounds from what you're describing like at least leading up to and around the time of the creation of the state of Israel that that was not the case.
Not the case, and I would say, in fact, the opposite of the case. That, uh, in fact, so for instance, today almost 20% of the Israeli Jewish population are ultra Orthodox Haredi. Don't serve in the military. The men often don't have jobs. It's a real issue and a sustainability issue outside of all the other issues. Uh, the reason they have those exclusions, that they don't have to do these things, it's because there were 500 ultra Orthodox people when Israel was declared, and they were given special privileges because it was understood that Orthodoxy and ultra Orthodoxy were disappearing. Uh, so, no, religious people were seen as fringy and crazy in this society. Really, until the late '60s is what I would say is when that begins to shift, and we'll do that in coming weeks. We'll focus on that shift. Right now, we're trying to sort of do these same sort of years and phenomenon through the two great Jewish polls, if that makes sense. Uh, other No other questions? Okay, let me say another note on Orthodoxy versus ultra Orthodoxy here for a moment, because ultra Orthodoxy really emerges during this time period as well. What distinguishes them? Well, first of all, remember that Reform is the first movement. Orthodoxy is a response to Reform and is um, if the walls of the ghetto are going to come down, we're going to build them back up intentionally. So then you end up with multiple versions of ultra orthodoxy or multiple versions of orthodoxy. And what comes to be known as ultra orthodoxy or Haredi, not Hasidic, Haredi, is defined as really about two things. The first is that they are anti secular education. The second is that they are anti Zionist, or at least a Zionist. And we mean this in a theological sense, most of all, that they do not believe that the state of Israel has any theological significance, even as they live in a theologically dominated world. Susan, is that a hand up or is that no, it's a hand up for other reasons. Um, okay, other questions here. Okay, so we end up with these two Jewish communities going in opposite directions, where American Jews increasingly are a religious community in a Protestant style, and Israeli Jews are a racial, national is probably the right word here, national community in a European style nation state kind of way. This all continues through the end of World War II and the Holocaust. Basically, all of European Jewry is wiped out, a third of all the Jews in the world. Uh, the ancient Jewish communities of Greater Poland are essentially entirely wiped out, entirely murdered. Uh, uh, the Jews of Europe who have amongst the highest rates of survival were often German Jews, which might seem counter to what you imagine, but the Holocaust came slower in Germany. It had a process leading up to it, and so people got out. By the time Germany is invading and waging World War II, they're taking over territories and murdering all their Jews as they go. Uh, and so the overwhelming majority of these Jews are murdered in concentration camps, in pogroms, in um, all sorts of ways. It's really important when we are studying the Holocaust, and we're going to do more on the Holocaust, but it's really important to understand that the Holocaust, by and large, was not committed by a small group of Nazis. Jews are murdered by their neighbors. Jews are murdered by locals. There is no trouble getting Poles and Hungarians to work to murder Jews. And these are the communities that it's just, there aren't even words to describe what happens in these places, right? Where everyone is murdered, right? You end up with 6 million Jews or so who are killed. You end up with 1 million children who are killed. It is en masse. It is Christian European wide. And it doesn't stop at the end of the Holocaust. Polish Jews who survived, who go back home, have pogroms where tens of thousands of Jews are murdered by their neighbors afterwards. It's um, I think we've also, hopefully, as a part of the story of us, shown how the Holocaust is not exceptional to Christian European society. It is the only thing that is exceptional is modernity and the ways that technology enables this destruction to happen in a systematic way that pre-industrial societies uh, couldn't manage. That is the exceptional piece. In the same way that we looked at the Spanish Inquisition as not being a standalone moment, but instead is actually in some ways being Spain's way of joining Christian Europe. Right? How do you become a part of Europe? You kick out all your Jews. Uh, we can see this in the Holocaust as well. Marilyn.
Not to take anything from that, but it's what happened in Guatemala. It has to be the indigenous people.
Yep.
You decide who's standing in the way of you, and wholesale massacre.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
something in humanity that is so hard to accept that we're so capable of doing this.
None of us are talking about it, and it's not entirely clear why. But right, Donald Trump has said that if he's elected, he's going to deport 20 million people from the United States. Even the high end estimates say that there are 10 million or so undocumented people in the United States. So even that would be a crime against humanity almost without measure. But then now you're talking another 10 million on top of that who are not undocumented people. So right, like we see this over and over again. It's not new, and I don't want to get us lost in Trump because we have 8 minutes left of our session here. So we see these two societies beginning to separate. I want to move forward just a little bit with Israeli immigration patterns here to give us some background for the weeks moving forward. So I'm going to give you very rough numbers, and I'm giving you these rough numbers on purpose. I want numbers that you can hold in your head, not exact numbers. So you end up with about 500,000 Jews who are living in the state of Israel by the time you hit 1948 or so. Once Israel becomes a state, there's about 500,000 Jews in it. Over the course of the mid 50s to the late 50s, you get about 500,000 Holocaust survivors who make their way to Israel as well. Notice it's not in the early 50s. Most of these folks end up in DP camps for a long time. Interestingly, there's a whole phenomenon of a number of Holocaust survivors who first go to Israel and then end up in the United States long term. That's a relatively common story that you hear from people. So you get about 500,000 Holocaust survivors who make their way there. They are their own group. They're a distinct thing, and particularly in Israel, they're a distinct thing. So then you have 500,000 founders and 500,000 Holocaust survivors. And remember, even that founders group is made up of those who went over for highly Zionist ideological or socialist reasons, and those who went because there was nowhere else they could go. The vast majority, nowhere else they could go. And then you get 500,000 Holocaust survivors who end up there because there's nowhere else they can go. Then over the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's something close to 1 million Jews who are pushed out, kicked out, ethnically cleansed, incentivized out, different situations, different moments. None of it was entirely voluntary from the broader Arab and Muslim world who make their way to Israel. We were talking the wholesale liquidation of the Yemenite community, the Iraqi, the Persian Iranian community, the Algerian and Tunisian and Egyptian and Turkish and ancient Jewish communities. I think I've mentioned it before, but one of my absolute favorite statistics around this is that prior to World War I, something like 40% of Baghdad is Jewish. And today there are essentially no Jews in Baghdad. Uh, Almost all of these people end up coming to Israel. All sorts of interesting things to learn about this, by the way, around the ways that they are treated poorly when they come to Israel, and they are discriminated against by the Ashkenazi Israeli elite who saw them as sort of unwashed, embarrassing masses rather than the sort of educated European style people that they were. Uh, and interestingly, much of the rightward turn on politics today is about this population's rejection of the socialism of their Ashkenazi oppressors. But um, that's for another day. Uh, but so all of a sudden, you end up with about 500,000 early Zionists, pre state folks. You get about 500,000 Holocaust survivors who are their own thing. You get about 1 million Arab Jews. They would never describe themselves as Arab Jews, but I am using that phrase right here. And I'm using it because I want to just bring home that anything you imagine about Arab peoples, you should imagine about these peoples. Uh, their politics, their worldview, their foods, their languages, their type and manners of religiosity, their all of these things are Arab, not European. And so now you've got about 1 million of those, and then two other 500,000 populations. Over the course of primarily the 80s into the 90s, you get something like 800,000 people flee from the Soviet Union, including 100,000 of them who are entirely Christian and just make up Jewish ancestry in order to come. Uh, these Soviets, I also want to, well, many of us know Soviet Jews in the United States. And if we know Soviet Jews, then we know that they are very different from Jews whose families came from many of the same places 100 years before them. Soviet Jews, former Soviet Jews, tend to be right wing in their politics, right wing in their worldview. They tend to, um, yeah, just have a very different uh, uh, general disposition. And the same is true of Soviet Jews who end up in Israel. Often much more secular, often much more right wing, and not very democratic in their values. You get something like 150,000 Jews who flee from Ethiopia, make their way to Israel. Uh, and these are the main populations, Jewish populations of Israel today. To the point where 73% of Jewish Israelis describe themselves as being Arab Jews. I mean, they don't, none of them say they're Arab Jews, but Mizrahi. Uh, that it is far and away the most common Jewish identity in Israel. These people tend to be right wingers and amongst the biggest supporters of Bibi Netanyahu and biggest supporters of this war and the most racist populations against Palestinians. Right? It's if you stop thinking of people in idealized ways and instead think of them as regular people, of course it's the case that those who lived in the Arab world and were kicked out and became refugees and made their way to Israel would be the ones who are the most discriminatory against the local Arab population there, Palestinians. It's not the way we'd like the world to work, but if we put that aside, of course that's the way that it is. It's not surprising. It's very understandable. Uh, so that's the Jewish population, and that's the breakdown right there of the major immigrations. Yeah, Jason, I saw a hand up.
I was just going to say, you're describing a polyglot world that is so profoundly different from this hermetic bubble in which I reside here in South St. Louis. I
Yep,
mean, which is why travel is essential. I
yep.
mean, it's just so illuminating. We live in an Ashkenazi society, and you've just uh, described why Israeli cultural politics are the way. I mean, I don't know any Mizrahi Jews. I don't know one. So
wow, it's just such a distinction.
So I also want to raise that even higher and say that if you're a Mizrahi Jew in the United States, you're sort of not even really a Mizrahi Jew anymore in the Israeli sense. Because in the United States, how do we divide up Jew? What kind of Jew are you? Right? If I ask any of you on here, Susan Spiegel, what kind of Jew are you? You're not going to say Mizrahi, Yemenite, Russian. You probably won't even say Ashkenazi. You'll probably say Reform or conservative or Orthodox or secular, or which is to say that if you ask American Jews what kind of Jew they are, they will give you an answer that is about religious denomination. Even as, by the way, we're not a terribly religious group, but we still divide ourselves around religious lines. If you ask an Israeli what kind of Jew are you, they will tell you Yemenite, Moroccan, Ashkenazi, Tel Avivi, Chiloni, secular, but it means something different there. You'll get all sorts of different answers like that that aren't about religion. They are about tribe, ethnicity. So we see the ways that those sort of early ways that Jewish identity split still are playing out for us today. Okay, I feel like we got a lot done today, Story of Us. Any last thoughts or questions or comments or anything?
It really has very scary implications for going forward because American Jews, Israeli Jews are not looking at themselves in the same way. And it explains why we're seeing the divisions in response to what's going on. And, you know, we as Jews, whether it's religious or cultural or tribal, we have to find our way through it.
Yep. Yep.
If we get kicked out of the U.S. by Trump, who's called us every name in the book from vermin to scum to disloyal to
Yep. In really scary
Yeah.
ways. Yep.
Yeah.
He's getting a good section of his money from someone who's Jewish.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's wild.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Leslie, did you have a question?
This is recorded, correct?
It is.
And when is it available?
I'll upload it as soon as we hang out.
Because I missed the beginning. Thank you.
We were talking all about you at the beginning too. It was everyone.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay. See everyone next week.
thank you.
Shana Tova. Happy New Year.
Recording stopped.